There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video is made possible due to those who support me on Patreon. I'd like to give a big shout out to patrons Christopher Spirit B, Conrad Truitt, Dan Ray, Eric Navarro, Flake, Frame by Frame, Joseph Abrams, Kristen Bennett, Kyle Kramer, Majin Wiebe, Mariah, Matthew Gay, Sophia Narwitz, and Stephen Dillon. Thank you all for your support. Also, my new live streaming gaming channel is live, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. As a kid, I spent a lot of time at my Grammy's house, where me and my cousins would gather around her built-like-a-nuclear missile silo Magnavox television and watch one of the 3 VHS tapes she had: Fried Green Tomatoes, Christmas Around the World with Perry Como, and the 1990 live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. My vote would always be for Fried Green Tomatoes, but more often than not I would be overruled, and we'd end up watching Ninja Turtles. Having previously revisited my dormant childhood memories with my video on Meet Joe Black, I figured I'd do the same for the original live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles trilogy, and see how well they stack up 30 years later. Quick note, I am not at all familiar with either the OG comics nor the animated series that debuted in 1987, so I won't be factoring them into my analysis, although I'd love to hear any insights from those who are in the comments. And with all that said, let's dive in. Fucking copyright bullshit. Normally I'd hop right into the review, but the making of this film is too insane to not discuss. Despite the franchise's popularity throughout the 1980s, major studios wanted nothing to do with the project, due to the failure of other recent comic book adaptations. The film found backing via Hong Kong production company Golden Harvest and began filming as an independent production with a mere $13.5 million budget. The turtle costumes were famously created by Jim Henson's Creature Workshop. Though their design even to this day remains the highlight of the film, they were absolute torture for the actors. The more complex suits used for close-ups used animatronics to generate the facial expressions, which not only made them deafeningly loud, but resulted in them weighing up to 70 pounds. Even the less cumbersome latex costumes used for action scenes were suffocatingly hot. Following the completion of principal photography, Golden Harvest was not happy with the film's dark and gritty tone, and ended up firing both editor Sally Menke, who would go on to become Quentin Tarantino's go-to editor, and director Steve Barron, who had rose to fame by directing some of the most acclaimed music videos of all time. According to Marta Every, Menke's apprentice on the set of the film, Barron and Golden Harvest butted heads about the tone of the final cut. Barron decided to hold a screening for other investors without the knowledge of Golden Harvest, for which he was fired, leaving the studio to finish post-production without the film's editor or director. Given this clusterfuck of a tale, you would think the film would have been a disaster, but against all odds, it raked in an insane $200 million worldwide gross, making it the highest grossing independent film ever made, a title it held for nearly a decade until being surpassed by the Blair Witch Project. While the film received mixed critical reception, today it is looked upon fondly by the fandom, considered far and away the best live-action adaptation of the source material. But putting nostalgia aside, does the film hold up? Holy fuck yes. Ironically, the film's most captivating aspect is also what made Golden Harvest so fearful that it would fail: its dark and even violent tone, more akin to that of a crime thriller than a comic book movie. In fact, the film was so dark, both Judith Hoag, who portrays April O'Neil, and Jim Henson took issue with the final cut. It even needed to tone down the violence to get past the ratings board. In the scene where Master Tatsu strikes a Foot Clan member, the member was supposed to have been killed, but this was amended during post-production using ADR.
You'll be alright. You'll be alright.
The film of course has its moments of humor, but the comedy comes almost entirely from the personalities of the characters. And though the film does lean into the absurdity of its premise, such as the scene where April first meets Splinter and the Turtles, or the utility of Raphael's covert disguise, the film takes itself ever so seriously, and somehow it works, bringing a grittiness to the genre that had never been seen before, and could even be said to have been the precursor to the darker comic book adaptations we see today. What What really stands out is the characterization of the brothers. While in the following films, their personalities sort of blend together, here we see each given a very distinct vibe. Leonardo, the disciplined leader, Michelangelo, the childish jokester, Donatello, the easygoing intellectual, and Raphael, the brooding rebel. This is even communicated via subtle differences in the design of each brother's costume. Leo's eyes are slightly more narrow than the others, communicating seriousness and focus, whereas Michelangelo's are wider, giving him a more innocent demeanor. It really goes to show just how much passion was put into this project by the filmmakers and especially the creatives at Henson's workshop. Judith Hoag is fantastic as April, bringing so much personality and sarcastic wit to the role. At the time of landing the role, Judith was co-starring in Cadillac Man with Robin Williams, who, being a big fan of the comic series, gave her insight into the character. It was also her idea to do away with the bright yellow jumpsuit, which, while iconic, probably would have looked a little silly in contrast with the film's darker tone. They ended up compromising with the yellow raincoat she wears in the film's opening scene. Also, she's hot as fuck. One scene in particular, in shaping my identity as a thigh guy. The criminally underrated Elias Koteas is excellent as Casey Jones. His cocky charm, him butting heads with April, even the small tidbit about him being claustrophobic and not knowing what it means.
You're a claustrophobic.
You want a fist in the mouth? I've never even looked at another guy before.
All adding so much to the film. And while this didn't apply to me when I was a kid, rewatching the film now, the voice acting is all around excellent. Not only that of the four brothers, but also Splinter, who is voiced by Kevin Clash, famously known as the voice of Elmo. Both the acting and voice work of Shredder make the character legitimately intimidating, putting the majority of the villains in the MCU to utter shame. Honestly, there is so much good in the film, it's hard not to gush. The fight choreography, the soundtrack, the production design that accentuates the gritty aesthetic the filmmakers were going for, budget constraints leading to some very cool creative problem solving. The opening scene where the turtles save April was actually supposed to be an entire fight scene, but this was scratched, and instead it was only implied off screen, which retrospectively works well to build the anticipation of the brothers' reveal. There is even some experimental-esque filmmaking, the flashback scenes being shot on Super 8 to give them a more grainy look. But what really makes the film such an amazing piece of work is its emotional depth. Themes of family and brotherhood playing as a sort of quasi-coming-of-age tale. Following Splinter being kidnapped by Shredder, the brothers must face being separated from their father for the first time in their lives, struggling to process their guilt and control their erratic emotions, initially lashing out at one another, but slowly coming together as a team and facing their fears head-on. Even the subplot following the character of Danny, which I used to think was sort of pointless, further fleshes out these themes, demonstrating how a lack of guidance, particularly for young men, can lead them into the hands of those who will capitalize on their anger to manipulate and control them, but that by extending love and care, they can become the men they seek to be. I honestly cannot praise it enough, and I highly recommend either checking it out for the first time or giving it a rewatch if you haven't seen it in a while. You may be surprised just how well it holds up even today. Well, that was quite the heaping of praise. Sort of a nice change of pace for the channel, wouldn't you say? However, now it's time to talk about the sequel. Once again, I feel it is important to discuss the film's pre-production, as it puts into context and explains its, how should I say, lukewarm result. Given that the producers wanted to capitalize on the success of the first film, the sequel, while given twice the budget, was rushed into production, being released less than a year later. Here's a riddle for you kids out there. What happens when you take a comic IP adaptation that was immensely successful due to its bold interpretation of the source material, crafted by a passionate team of creatives and a seething gaggle of production executives whose only goal is to milk it for as much cash as they can by way of making it as marketable as possible? The answer, exactly what you'd fucking expect. Seeing as Steve Barron was canned during post-production of the first film, there was nothing standing in the way of Golden Harvest taking the reins in regard to the direction of the product. And thus, the darker tone that made the first film stand out so much, yeah, that's gone. Since the violence in the first film was its most controversial element, priority was given to sanitizing the sequel as much as possible. Casey was completely written out since he was seen as a main source of the first film's edgy feel. I actually didn't even realize this until it was pointed out to me, but the Turtles hardly use their weapons at all throughout the film, in which there are less than a handful of fight scenes, leading to the choreography being incredibly lackluster. Because of this effort to do away with the original film's aesthetic and tone, the sequel is just like sterile, so boring that there is hardly anything to say about it. As for the rest of the film, well, you know what, let's start with the good. While Jim Henson passed away only mere weeks after the release of the first film, the Creature Workshop's artist returned to work on the sequel. However, it should be noted that Jim's son Brian, who took over the shop after his father's passing, did not take part in working on the film due to Barron being fired by Golden Harvest. Regardless, the costume effects are once again phenomenal. However, they don't look as impressive as they did in the first film. In retrospect, I think this was mostly due to the first film's darker photography, which helped make the suits look less artificial, whereas in the sequel, the lighting is very flat and boring, thus making any small flaws stick out a lot more. The one sincere point of praise I want to extend is that the film really gave Donatello more time to shine. In the first film, Raph and Mikey were given the most focus, with Leo coming in third, and unfortunately, Donnie kind of got pushed into the back seat. His personality is the least defined, and he is mostly used in conjunction with Mikey to elicit most of the film's humor. But here, both his goofy demeanor and his intelligence are highlighted to a much greater extent. And that's about it. While Donnie is more fleshed out, there is a very evident muting of the brothers' personalities. In the first film, their personalities were so well defined, you could almost differentiate them based solely on their body language. But here, their individuality seems watered down, almost as if there are times that, were it not for their bandanas, I wouldn't even be able to tell them apart. April has been recast, with Paige Turco taking up the mantle. Apparently, Judith Hoag was not invited back due to the fact that she had the absolute audacity to raise concerns in regard to the safety of the stunt actors during production of the first film. Turco has a decent chemistry with the brothers, but the film just doesn't give her that much to do. There's no Casey for her to play off of. In fact, them getting together at the end of the first film isn't even mentioned. She feels like much more of a side character as opposed to a part of the team as she did in the first film. New character Kino is fine, I guess. I guess he's meant to be an amalgamation of Casey Jones and Danny, both a sidekick to the brothers and the young impressionable kid who Splinter takes under his wing, but since he is filling a space previously occupied by two different characters, he ends up not really delivering on either front. He doesn't get an opportunity to really team up with the Turtles, nor does his supposed arc about learning to only use violence as a last resort go anywhere. That isn't to say that Ernie Reyes Jr. gives a bad performance. He was actually the suit actor for Leonardo in the first film, thus his fighting ability is fucking badass. He simply wasn't given enough development. Then there is the return of Shredder, which... why? I get he is the villain of the franchise, but you beat him. Like, why are we doing this all over again? And the fact that the film begins with Shredder somehow surviving being crushed by a fucking garbage truck compactor, like, it's a film about mutant turtles who like pizza, and this is what breaks your suspension of disbelief. Then again, I guess the fact that Casey straight up murdered him in the first film need to be retconned to stick with the sequel's less edgy feel. Despite how silly Shredder's return is, I would have been cool with it if it had some thematic purpose. Since it was Splinter who took him out in the first film, maybe they could have set it up as the Turtles needing to take him down on their own this time. But instead, he ends up infecting himself with the Ooze only to accidentally crush himself. The Turtles don't even exchange a single blow with him. Wow, what a finale. And that is on top of the fact that Shredder's imposing presence in the first film is almost completely gone. Him coming off as much more of a clownish Dr. Evil type in some scenes. He gets nerfed by a speaker for fuck's sake. Taka and Razar, despite their seemingly deadly appearance, are also used solely for comedic effect. Apparently the filmmakers wanted to incorporate the characters of Bebop and Rocksteady, but couldn't get the rights to do so. However, the big disappointment is that the emotionally resonant through line present in the first film is almost entirely missing from the sequel. The plot kicks off after the discovery of the same Ooze that led to the brothers' mutation, which seems to set up some sort of emotional conflict in regard to the turtles being faced with the true nature of their existence. Donatello is at first eager to learn where he and his brothers came from, but later laments upon discovering they are simply the result of a chemical experiment and not special as he had always wanted to believe. It's a decent beat, but doesn't lead to any significant emotional arc. It would have been interesting to see how each brother reacts to this revelation, which would have been a chance for some decent dramatic conflict, as well as letting each brother's individuality shine through. There also seemed to be some potential in regard to the turtles' frustration that while they saved the city from Shredder in the previous film, they are forced to continue to hide in the shadows. Perhaps the public learned of their existence and are at first horrified, but slowly the brothers are able to win over the people of the city. However, this never gets developed. I mean, maybe that's what the Vanilla Ice dance sequence was meant to signify, but I would much rather just scrub that from my memory. All in all, the sequel is a major step down from its predecessor. But hey, at least it can't get any worse, right? Oh dear. While the second installment was a box office success, it received a significantly lower return than that of the first film. Thus, Golden Harvest figured the franchise was running out of steam and wanted to give it one last hurrah. So since the third film was developed as a desperate cash grab, it should go without saying it was pretty devoid of any sort of passion or creativity. The first thing to note is that it seems like the producers were so invested in the project, they didn't even bother to give it a subtitle. Like, the second film is subtitled The Secret of the Ooze, so you'd think this film would also have a subtitle, but it just doesn't. Apparently many mistakenly believe the film's subtitle is Turtles in Time, but that is actually the title of an SNES game that came out a couple years earlier and has no relation to the film whatsoever. Despite this, the film is still mistakenly subtitled as such on some DVD and Blu-ray releases. However, after doing a little digging, I discovered there are some pieces of media that refer to the film as having the subtitle The Sacred Scroll of Death, which I presume must have been in reference to a previous draft of the script, since there is no Scroll of Death present in the film whatsoever. There is a scroll that foreshadows the turtles going back in time, but that's it. It doesn't factor into the rest of the plot whatsoever. That thematic coordination though, am I right? The majority of the stunt and voice actors did not return for this installment for whatever reason, but the biggest loss here is the work of Jim Henson's Creature Workshop, who did not return to work on the third film, the animatronics being done by the All Effects company, and the comparison is jarring to say the least. Aside from the more blatant design differences, the face shape, the spots, those subtle differences I spoke of in the first film being completely absent here, with the design of all four brothers looking pretty much identical, it took me a bit to put my finger on the main reason as to why their design just feels off. And I really think it's the eyes. There is just so much more life present in the eyes, especially in the first film, whereas here, it's almost unsettling just how artificial and dead they look. In addition to how the design of each brother is almost indistinguishable for one another, the same goes for their personalities. I thought they were less defined in the second film, but here, aside from a handful of scenes, their individuality is basically absent. Oh yeah, I was supposed to start off with the good, wasn't I? Well, the production design of 17th century Japan is pretty dope. The film actually gives Paige Turco stuff to do, making April feel like a much more defined character. The plot and new characters are somewhat interesting, and that's about it. The premise itself isn't bad per se, rather confusing. April brings the turtles a magic scepter which transports them all back to 17th century Japan, where they become involved in a rebellion against a feudal lord, which, like I said, it's somewhat interesting, but what's so baffling about it is, like, wouldn't the entire point of sending the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to feudal Japan be for them to interact with actual ninjas? The rebellion plot is, I'd say, more engaging than whatever the turtles are doing at any given time. Thus, they come off as more of a distraction to the plot as opposed to its focus. I also have no idea why, if Golden Harvest was so intent on toning down the violent film of the first film, there are so many instances of the turtles being straight up threatened with guns. I'd like to say the return of Elias Koteas as Casey Jones is a positive, but all he does is babysit the Japanese guards who the turtles switch places with. It's a single gag extended into an overlong and pointless B-plot. They also cast Koteas as Wit, an English spy in the Japanese timeline, and April notes that he looks exactly like Casey, but this goes absolutely nowhere. Like, was he supposed to be Casey's ancestor? I don't think they really thought this through. As for the emotional through line, like the second film, there are hints of promise, but they never deliver. Raphael befriends a young boy named Yoshi, and there are a few nice scenes where they interact. Raphael sort of acting as a big brother or fatherly influence, much the same way Splinter was for him. At first glance, it seems like an actual instance of character development. Raph having overcome the anger he displayed in the first film and using his experience to help another. But this glimmer of emotional depth is dropped like a hot potato. And then there is the beat of Mikey and Raph wanting to stay in the past, which, again, at first glance showed some promise, with it almost seeming like a continuation of the idea introduced in the previous film. How the Turtles resent that while they protect the citizens of the city which they call home, they will never be able to be accepted by them. Whereas here, they have found a community that accepts them where they don't have to hide who they are. It's interesting, but is very poorly developed, and in retrospect sort of comes out of nowhere towards the end of the film. Also, the idea that Raph and Mikey would abandon Splinter without a second thought is absolutely ludicrous. And yeah, there really isn't much more to say about this one. The most enjoyment I got out of the final installment had nothing even to do with the film. While doing research, I came across an AFI catalog page that states the Turtles had actually visited the White House to promote early childhood vaccination. So I desperately combed through 40 pages of LA Times archives from April 1993 to hopefully find a picture of the Turtles with Billy Boy C. But unfortunately, I came up empty. However, I did come across this absolutely hilarious review in which the writer interviews some kids at a screening of the film, and it's blatantly obvious she just made it all up. This woman is a fucking staff writer at the LA Times, probably with aspirations to report on world events, and her bosses were like, hey, you need to do a write-up on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3. Like, just the image of a grown woman buying a single ticket to this shit, and then going home and nursing a pint of whiskey as she is begrudgingly forced to suffer through the lowest level of journalistic hell, was enough to give me a chuckle. All in all, despite the tidal wave of nostalgia that crashed over me as I revisited these films, and the absolute trip reading up on their production was, it was actually quite disheartening to see how much promise the first film demonstrated compared to how the trilogy came to a close in such soulless fashion. I actually have not seen the most recent live action adaptations, but have heard they aren't as blatantly horrible as I assumed they were, so maybe I'll check them out in the future. But as of now, another dormant childhood memory has been put to rest, and all is well. Now go watch the original live action film and thank me later.